Hi guys, it's Lara. Thanks for watching and welcome back to my channel. So this is going to be my very last official video as a video blogger because, as I already announced, I'm quitting YouTube. So if you missed all that, I filmed a video in which I have talked about my experience on YouTube over the years and about some of the reasons why I decided to quit. So I will link the video down below and also here in the right corner. And after I'll be finished filming this video, I will literally pack my entire film equipment and I'm gonna be sending it to our friend Jordan, aka Conscious Muscle. This is not a sponsored video or anything. I'm mentioning this just because Jack and I are big supporters of Jordan's and we believe in his cause. He's an online fitness trainer, a vegan bodybuilder, and he also has his own animal sanctuary, which is amazing because he literally dedicated his entire life and all his life savings to helping animals, and that's amazing. And he's not just helping out the animals in his sanctuary, but with one of his friends, he's also supporting other sanctuaries in need, and that's just great. Again, I think that the world definitely needs more people like Jordan, and that's why I decided to give him my entire film equipment because he wants to do YouTube also, and I'm really happy to help him out because it can be really pricey at the beginning when you're getting all this stuff together, and having good lights and a microphone can definitely increase the video quality. And I'll be also helping him out with editing in future, about which I'm very, very excited. Again, I'm not gonna be paid for that. I'm not gonna get any free stuff. I'm doing it just because I want to volunteer. I want to help out. Just to clarify that. So that was a little bit long for an intro. Sorry about that, but I thought this is definitely worth mentioning. And my last video is gonna be something I promised. I promised to talk about my experience working as a flight attendant. So I've worked for a discount airline that does not exist anymore. And I would like to talk about how it was working for that airline in general, my personal experience and stuff like that. I'm also going to be talking a little bit about what I earned and how it was working, crazy hours. So if that's something you're interested in, then please keep watching. By the way, this entire video is going to be 100% podcast style, so I won't be showing anything. So you can simply listen to the video while you will be doing something around the house, or you can grab your yoga mat and do a few stretches, or simply lean back and close your eyes. And I will also add a few timestamps down below in case this is too long for you to watch in one piece. And now let's jump right into this. So back when I applied for the job as a flight attendant, for me personally, it was a huge step up. I emigrated in the 90s, and when I came to Austria, it was not easy for me to find a job. I finished high school and I already spoke multiple languages. However, my German, even though it was really good, was not that great when I compare it to my German today, because my grammar improved over the years. And the way I can express myself got, of course, so much better after all these years. So I've been usually working as a waitress. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I think it's a fun job and it's a really hard job. And I feel that waitresses are seriously underpaid. They should definitely get compensated much more because it's a tough job. Like, it's really hard on your body and also on your mind. And the hours that people are working as waitresses or waiters are really crazy. So anyway, I've been working in the gastronomy sector. And after I met Jack, I wanted to do something different. I wanted to work during the day because when we met, I was working as a bar manager. And the only day when I had the day off that we had in common was Sunday, but I usually slept till at least noon because I came home very late, and because I've been working till like 5 in the morning or something like that. I wanted to spend more time with Jack and with my to-be stepson. So as a result, I started looking for a new job, which ended up being a very tiring process, especially because it was not that long after the Iron Curtain fell. And since I'm someone from a former Eastern European country and I had only a high school degree from an Eastern European country, it ended up being more difficult than I thought because I simply did not have the same cards like someone native or someone from a Western country. I do kind of understand because back when the borders opened, not only nice people came over, so people had really some bad experiences here, so they were sometimes really hesitant. It still was very frustrating for me. So anyway, I was kind of fed up after a while having crappy jobs, and when I found out that this airline was hiring, I thought I'm gonna give it a shot because it sounded really good. So I applied and I was invited to an assessment center. So basically I did a set of interviews, then there were a few group discussions where all the people that were interested in that job were supposed to discuss a certain subject. It was pretty random, but the point was not what you had to say about the subject. There was always someone from the airline observing because they wanted to know about our behavior. Like, for example, are you someone who's gonna kind of take the leading role in a discussion like that, or are you going to be more passive and stuff like that? It was very interesting. Then there was a room where they had a few chairs lined up like seats in an airplane, and people who already worked for that company sat down and pretended, like, did a role play. They were like customers or like passengers, and they put us through different situations. So for example, someone was pretending being an angry passenger and they wanted to know how you would react, what you would say, how would you manage the situation. So it was all really exciting, and I met some really cool people. And at the end, they hired 30 people and I was one of them. So we started going to a course a few weeks later. We also had to go to a few doctors because they had to check our health and see if we were actually able to fly, because your ears have to be in a really good shape because you need to be able to balance the pressure when you're landing and when you're starting and stuff like that. And they checked your heart rate and in general your stamina. And the course, I don't remember exactly how long the course went, but I think it was either a month or a little bit over a month. We were already hired. We were paid only a minimal wage. And then once we started working full time, we got paid the regular wages. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit later. So when we went to the course, we learned first aid, we learned flight safety, we did some trainings in a airplane model. It was a part of an airplane, and we were basically simulating an airplane crash. Then we also had a mock-up training on water, where we would use one of the slides as a way how to save all the passengers, and it was a lot of fun. We also had some firefighter training. That was really exciting. That's actually something I would love to do again. And there was a lot to learn. We also learned a lot about the company, about the background, about the philosophy. And after we finished the course, there were several tests, and the most important one was flight safety, because that's actually why we were hired. Even though as a flight attendant, you are serving drinks and food, but the main reason you are there is to help people if anything happened, like if someone got injured or sick, or if there were an emergency. So that was the most important part. So I passed all the tests successfully and I was allowed to start working. The airline I worked for would fly mostly short or middle long distances, so there were no long distance flights, which also meant that with the exception of few days, I would always come home after my flights, and that was a really good thing. However, as good as it sounds, the hours were really sometimes really crazy. Now, when you would have a flight schedule for the month and you would look only at the times of the flights, it would sound like, oh, this is a short day. But we had to be a certain time already in the office building before the flight. We had to check in. Then we had to sit down and we had a briefing with the senior flight attendant, and then we would have a briefing with the pilot. Then we would go to the airplane, had to prep the airplane for the passengers. And then when the day ended and when we landed on our last flight, we also had to go back to the office building and we had to check out. So they had these machines, and we had like a a card, like ID card for every single person, and we had to do it in person. So it took a while, of course, also to go to the airport. So you had to count at least 2 hours before and after each flight. So even though you would look at the flight schedule and you would say, oh, it's only 6 hours work for you, but it ended up being like 10 hours being gone because you had to commute, obviously. And again, there were these requirements for checking in the office building and checking out. So if you looked at the schedule and you had there like a 10 hours long flight or 12 hours long flight, you can imagine how tired we were. And sometimes between the flights, the only time you had was to go home, throw your uniform into the machine and then dryer and go back to sleep and hope that the uniform is going to be dry enough in the morning, because at the beginning we had only one uniform per person, which was ridiculous, especially with the working schedule. And I found it really awful because that was kind of saving the money at the wrong end, because on one hand they even made it part of the contract that we always had to appear clean and our appearance had to be pleasant. But then again, they gave us only one uniform, where I was like, really? That's kind of difficult, especially when sometimes you had to spend the night somewhere outside of Vienna when you had a flight that would require you to sleep somewhere. So for example, I would fly some charter flight to some holiday destination. We would come back in a different base and sleep there, and then the next day fly again something and then come back to our base in Vienna. So that was pretty challenging. Later on, we were given a new uniform because they changed the design. So they gave us 2 summer and 2 winter uniforms, which of course improved our lives. However, I felt that it was still not enough. I think having at least 3 sets of each would have been so much better, especially during the main season, because sometimes when we flew the charters and stuff like that, we would have to sleep 2 nights outside of our main base. It did not happen often, but it did happen occasionally. And that meant on one day I had to put on the uniform I wore the entire long day before, and I felt kind of disgusting, even though I would have an undershirt. But you know, you were working with food and there were sometimes little kids and stuff gets spilled and stuff like that. So it would have been much nicer to have at least 3 sets of each. The requirements when it came to our looks were kind of ridiculous. I remember we were specifically told that they wanted us to shave our legs and armpits. They would not put it in writing in the contract. They would make it a little bit more vague because in the contract it said we were supposed to come to work looking presentable, but in person they told us you have to shave your armpits and your legs, and they also wanted us to wear a pretty dramatic makeup with the original uniform. And then they went to the other extreme. I mean, they still wanted us to shave our legs and armpits, but then they said no more dramatic makeup, only a very subtle makeup, and suddenly we were not even allowed to wear an eyeliner. So that was kind of random. But to be honest, I was kind of relieved when they announced that from the day on, when they announced it, they wanted us to wear only a very subtle makeup because it made life just so much easier, because we were already working crazy hours, not having enough uniforms. So it saved us a lot of time in the morning in front of the mirror before we were rushing to work. I guess that you would probably want to know what a day in my life looked like back then. So let's say I had a short day in front of me, which would be, for example, flying Zurich, Paris that day. So I had to be very early in the office building. I would check in, then I would wait for the rest of the crew. We would sit down and we would discuss the plans for the flight with the senior flight attendant. Then the senior flight attendant would ask us a few questions from the flight safety manual, because that way we always kept the knowledge fresh and we always had to know the answer. Otherwise, we were not allowed to fly on that day. Then the pilot with his co-pilot would come and we would discuss the flight conditions and also the times. Because sometimes when you have a good wind, you can fly a little bit faster and stuff like that. And then we would all go together as a crew to the airplane. And this flight was usually the first flight of the day, which meant we had to prep the entire airplane. So we had to lay out the newspapers and make sure that there were everywhere the safety vests, and check all the equipment and everything, make sure that everything, like including the first aid kit and handcuffs and fire extinguisher and stuff like that, were on board. We had to sign it, and then when we laid out all the newspapers and prepared stuff for tea and coffee and stuff like that, the passengers would come. Since the airline I worked for was a discount airline, we would always have an outside position, which means the airplane would stand somewhere a little bit further from the main airport building, instead of being connected with the so-called finger, which is this kind of extendable tunnel that will be connected to the front door of the airplane. So we had smaller airplanes, we had Airbuses, and the passengers, when they arrived to our position with the airport buses, they could come through the front and through the back exit. And so depending on whether you were working the front of the cabin or the back of the cabin, we would stand there and greet the people and offer newspapers to them, and we would help them to store their luggage. We also had to make sure that everyone was on board. And before we started, we had to make sure that everyone's seatbelt was fastened and stuff like that. And then we started. When we arrived our travel position, then we would get up and prepare tea and coffee and set up the trolleys. And then we would go through the cabin once or twice, depending on the length of the flight. And we would make sure that everything was all right in the cabin. Sometimes people would have questions. Sometimes someone would get sick, or I don't know, like I did not have any injuries or anything like that. I did not have any emergency landing. So it was actually pretty relaxed during the flight, most of the time. And then before we landed, we had to store everything and lock everything. And then when we landed, we had to disarm the slides. There are these emergency slides at any exit, and you can either arm them, meaning if we had an emergency landing and someone would open the door, the slide would inflate. But on the airport, of course, you didn't want that, so you had to disarm it. There was a pin you had to take out. Well, then we opened the doors, and the passengers would go away, so we had to stand there and say numerous times, "Thank you for joining airline, thank you, goodbye," and stuff like that, smiling. At the end of the day, you felt like this was frozen, but it was still nice, and I really did enjoy that. So I can't say that it would be a horrible job in general, because the routine was actually nice, and even though it was mostly the same, it still was kind of, a routine that I liked going through. This airline, though, required a little bit more from their employees than just do all these things. Whenever we would land and the passengers would exit the airplane, the owner of the airline specifically wanted us to take a cleaning rag and clean all the windows, because he said he wants his passengers to look through a clean window, and he did not want to pay for that to the cleaning crew that came from the airport. And later on, he also decided that at some destinations, he wanted us to clean the airplane. So we had to clean the seats, the toilets, and stuff like that, instead of taking a few minutes rest. So that was also something that I found a little bit ridiculous. Not that there is anything wrong with cleaning stuff, but you have responsibility. You already work the airplane the whole time, and then when you land, you should actually have at least a few minutes to, have a coffee, like a little break, right? So I did not think that was right. Anyway, so on a day like that, we would prep the airplane because it was the first flight. Then we would fly to Zurich, stay a few minutes on ground, and then we cleaned the windows and got everything ready for the passengers that were flying with us back to Vienna. And then that went on because then we flew to Paris and then we came back to Vienna, and then another crew came who would take over the airplane and they flew somewhere else. And depending on whether I would be the first crew, like part of the first crew, or part of the crew that would take over the airplane during the day, there were certain procedures that had to be done before we flew. And if we only took over the airplane, we did not have to do the initial checks. However, if we were the last crew for the day, then there were certain checks we had to do before we went home, and we had to make sure that everything was ready for the next day in the morning. So basically, like in retail, if you have a shop, you want the shop to be ready for the next day already the day before in the evening, right? Even though flight attendants are in the airplane mainly for the safety of the passengers and to be of assistance if anything happens, the work is in general very similar to the work of a waitress or to a work in retail. And there's nothing wrong with that. I really enjoyed that. And sometimes it had something satisfying, you know, prepping the airplane, laying out the stuff and helping the people to sort their luggage, especially when you see that some people were nervous, and you always had a smile for them and made them feel better and made them feel confident that nothing can happen and we're here for you. So that was actually pretty rewarding. I'm sure you would like to hear some juicy stories from my work, but I honestly don't really have any. One time that was pretty disgusting, someone pooped himself. It was an old guy and apparently he had some issues, and shortly before we were landing, he suddenly stood up and the senior flight attendant yelled at him, "Hey, you have to sit down, we're about to land, otherwise you're gonna injure yourself." And he pooped himself and it stank and it was disgusting. But fortunately, when we landed, it was in a place where we had cleaning, so the cleaning personnel came and I felt so sorry for them because it was really disgusting. I never had any like vomiting accidents there. Usually when someone had to throw up, they simply used the sick bag and that was all. And in general, I never had any problems with passengers because I've been always someone who could reason with people, and even when I had someone who was originally angry, I always found a way how to talk to them and how to find a way that they would calm down, kind of, you know, make them feel like I understand your frustration. And you know, even if I just gave them a piece of paper and said, look, you can write everything down, I promise I will give it to the management, which I also did, and don't worry, you will be hurt and stuff like that. So I never had any problems. I did hear some stories from other people, but again, nothing crazy. I think one of the craziest thing was that a flight attendant got injured because one of the passengers brought a huge ceramic plate with them and put it in the overhead bin, and then the flight attendant needed something or wanted to hand someone a luggage from the same bin, and when she opened that, the plate flew out and injured her, but fortunately nothing serious. Then I've heard about someone not being willing to put their dog in a bag, and like in the traveling bag for dogs, and the dog would be running through the cabin, stuff like that. I don't remember if anyone had to restrain a passenger, to be honest, either. I think at least during the time when I was working for that airline, it was pretty easy, and people were actually pretty easy. And even though we had sometimes some groups that seemed a little wild at the beginning, it always worked out. I'm pretty sure you would also like to know how much I actually earned, because there is always this idea that flight attendants earn a lot of money. Now, there were times when I earned actually quite a lot. However, I don't find that it's a fair compensation for all the hard work you put in, especially considering that we were very often sleep deprived because our working schedule was really crazy and there was nothing regular. So the way it worked, we had some type of a basic salary. So that was, a part was just basic salary, and the other part was so-called hazard bonus, and that together came to 800 euros brutto. And then we got paid €5 per a so-called flight hour, which meant the airplane had to be in the air. So even if you were still at work, but the airplane touched the ground, you were not paid anymore. So they had this schedule up to 70 flight hours. You were paid €5. Between 71 and 90, it was, I think, €15. And beyond the 90, like from the 91st hour, you were paid €30 per flight hour. That sounds like a lot, but remember, that was only the time when the airplane was in air, which was about half of the time when you were at work. Yeah, maybe more than that. But it was still not fair, in my opinion, because there were times when we didn't have any choice. Like, you would fly, let's say, to Gran Canaria, and you would land, the passengers would go out, but the flight back would go in 2 hours. We were not allowed to leave. We had to sit in the airplane. I think we were allowed to go to the airport, but that was pretty much it. So you couldn't go and explore the town or anything like that because you were still at work, obviously. But you did not get paid for these 2 hours. You had to wait until the airplane was on its way back to your base. Also, we had so-called standby days. They were up to 18 hours long. And these days were not compensated either, unless you were called to work. Then you would get paid only again for the hours that you would spend in the air. So I have here an example of a month where I worked so much that I got even these €30 an hour, and I earned €1,860. But I worked some really crazy hours. I think I worked over, I think like 117 hours in the air that month, which does not sound like a lot. But again, you have to consider that that's just the time in air. That does not include the time between. And there were also flights. For example, I would fly early in the morning to Berlin as an active crew. A so-called deadhead crew was with us, which meant they flew like passengers with us, but they took over the airplane, flew some really longer distance, like to, I don't know, Tenerife, came back, and then we would take over the airplane again and fly as an active crew home, because there were like certain times that you were allowed to work maximum in the air on a day, and I think it was like 12 flight hours maximum. And then the idea was that people would not be able to react fast if anything happened, so that's why they were not allowed to fly back as an active crew. So we took over again, and between this long time when the people flew to Tenerife and back, we had to spend the time in a hotel in Berlin for what the company of course paid, but our time did not get paid. So that's the general idea how the payment worked there. That particular month I had 10 days off, and I had 1, 2, 3 standby days, which sounds like, oh, it's not a big deal. You still had your 10 days off, and I did not get called from the standby day. But again, the standby day is not a day off. You can't go anywhere, you can't do anything, and it can really happen that 5 minutes before your standby day ends, you're gonna be called and you have to go to the airport and go to work. And it did happen to me occasionally. So let's say my standby would be from the midnight the day before till the evening the following day, and I will already relax because I didn't get called, and then suddenly I got the call, in 3 hours you have a flight to Tenerife. So I did not get any sleep that day. So again, sleep deprivation. And on the days that I worked, I had days when I would work like 16 hours. And in total, again, it was not everything in the air, so I got paid only for the time in the air. But the time between, the time when I had to go to the airport and to the office building and stuff like that, that was just not included. So I did earn quite a nice money, but I don't think it's compensation enough for that type of work. And I think that we should have been paid much better. Of course, I realize that over €1,800, that's still an amazing money, but that was more an exception. I usually worked fewer hours, and I usually earned something around 1,400 euros, which is still a great payment, just not for this type of job. That's just not compensation enough. And I know there are people who are working equally hard jobs with equally crazy hours and they are being paid far worse. That still doesn't mean that this should be okay. I feel that every person in the world who is working hard should be compensated in a fair way, no matter what type of jobs they're doing, no matter what education the job requires. Everyone should be paid fair wage. Another thing I get asked a lot is, did you travel? Did you see a lot? No, because I've been usually at work, and being a flight attendant does not mean you get to do any sightseeing. It's a job. So I did not start working as a flight attendant with the idea that I will do a regular sightseeing, so I was not disappointed. But I get why people ask that, because it's really kind of cool when you say, oh, where you have been today. Yeah, I've been in Zurich and then in Paris, and tomorrow I'm flying to, let's say, Thessaloniki and Santorini and whatnot. But you get to stay in the airplane and you basically usually land and fly back pretty quickly. So we did not have any possibility. Plus, even when we had more time between the flights, we were not allowed to leave the airport anyway. So we could go and take a stroll through the airport, maybe get a coffee and stuff like that, but that was pretty much it. And now about something a little bit more positive. There were certain perks. So as someone who worked for an airline, we got some benefits when we, for example, needed an insurance. So when I started working for this airline, I needed to get a car because during that time, Jack was driving a lot to the office of the client whom he was working for most of the time. And it did not always work out with my schedule. So we figured it out at the beginning, but it was really difficult. And sometimes I could drive with someone home, but that also did not work all the time. So I decided to get my own car. And when I needed a car insurance, they specifically told us that if you need a car insurance, let us know. And they recommended us, they recommended to us some company, or I don't remember exactly how it worked, but I remember that we got basically the best deal that there was. And also as airliners, we could buy flight tickets from certain other airlines cheaper. Sometimes we would be able to fly with our own airline when there was enough space in the airplane. And there was also a shop for airliners on the airport where we could get stuff duty free. So there were, of course, certain perks. And in general, I met some pretty cool people and I had a lot of fun. I did not think that the payment was awful in general. I think it was still a nice payment for my standards. I think, again, it's just not enough for this type of hard work, but I was able to save some money too, which was nice. I actually stopped working not because I would feel so strongly about the payment or anything else. I actually stopped working mostly for health reasons because I once flew when my nose was a little bit stuffed, and they told us at the beginning you cannot fly when you get the cold because then you wouldn't be able to balance the pressure and that can damage your ears. I knew that my nose was a little bit stuffed. I just didn't think it was bad enough to do anything to my ears. So fortunately, I did not get any really serious injury, but my ears were very irritated. They were super red, and I had to stay home for over 3 weeks because I could not balance any air pressure. And it was very painful, and I've been having problems with my ears ever since. I mean, all the years before working in the gastronomy sector was already bad for my ears because some of the places were really loud, and as a result I'm extremely sensitive to sound anyway, and I can't stand loud sound, but this only added to that. Also, I've been having regularly migraines, and in general the sleep deprivation was really difficult for me because that's something I cannot really deal with long term. And I recognize that it's just too straining for me. Also, being in a relationship where I knew I want to stay with this guy for the rest of my life, I felt like that was not the right job for me. So in general, I think that even for a discount airline where I feel like the compensation should be better, I think it's not a bad job, especially for young people. When you're alone, when you don't have many hobbies or any other obligations, and you don't mind working a lot, and you don't mind not really sleeping enough in like through certain periods of times, you will earn nice money, you can save some money, and then you can take it from there. I think as long as you are alone, it's fine, but when you're in a relationship, I think it's really difficult. And even though Jack is someone who is extremely tolerant because he himself works a lot, it was still sometimes difficult. And I have a little doggy. I want to be home with my doggy. I can go and fly, right? So I think if I really would feel like I missed that job, I would rather work only part-time as a flight attendant, and then it wouldn't be so bad. And I would really want to work for an airline that can afford better compensation for their workers. Other than that, I would not be interested anymore. However, I have a huge respect for flight attendants, and I'm always super friendly and nice. I'm never complaining. I'm always making sure I don't make their job any harder than it already is. And honestly, I have respect for pretty much any job out there because every single job that exists has its purpose, and it's people who are doing these jobs. So I'm never really impressed by what someone's doing, or I don't think less of someone because their job is not on the list of top 10 or anything like that. The only way how people can impress me is their heart. So if someone's a cleaning lady or if someone's waiting toilet, I will treat these people equally. Like people who are, for example, managers of companies or who are being salespersons and stuff like that. Because for me, it's the people. They are not their jobs. So that's my general attitude about this. And that is pretty much all I have to say. I don't know if I forgot anything. If you have any more questions, feel free to write them down below and I will answer them to the best of my ability. With the exception of one question, I will not disclose what airline this was. I want them to stay anonymous. And that is it for today. That's also it basically for my channel. I completely forgot. This is my last video. I will definitely stop by occasionally. But again, I am donating my filming equipment to a friend. So it's gonna be basically only phone videos and only short live updates. And I actually don't know exactly when it's going to be the first live update, but if you want to keep in touch, you can always visit me on Instagram. As always, my Instagram accounts are linked down below. So thank you guys. Thank you so much for everything, especially for the incredibly kind words you have written to me underneath the video in which I have explained that I'm quitting YouTube. I was so touched and I still get tears in my eyes when I think about that. That's one of the reasons I haven't responded yet, because I get always super emotional when I read these comments. So I promise I will respond. Just give me some time. And now I'm definitely gonna take a break for a while. Also probably a little bit from Instagram. But I will still keep posting on Instagram. And at some point I will come here to my channel and post a short live update, and I don't know when it's gonna be, but I promise I will not forget you. So thank you all so much, and until next time, I love you guys so much and take good care of yourself. Bye.